Hi, this is Bill Raymond, and welcome to the next video in my series for creating a Docker image for AI and machine learning using Visual Studio Code. At this point in the video series, you now have a working AI and machine learning Docker image. So you can just copy and paste that folder and keep reusing it. But what about maybe making sure it's under some sort of source control using Git? And maybe even putting that folder up into a place where you can collaborate with others, share this with others, or at least just have it up in the cloud so that if you ever lose the folder, you can always go back and get the original. That's what we're going to do in this video. We're going to set up Git and GitHub so that we can use this as a template from the GitHub website. Let's get started. Since we're going to work with GitHub, it turns out we are going to need Git the software on our primary computer, not just in the dev container. So you are going to have to install this on your computer. Like, for example, I'm using a Mac right now. We're going to put that onto my Mac. Go to git-scm and locate the area where you can download it for your operating system. After you've downloaded it and installed it, follow the instructions under this Pro Git book here. This is an online free book, so I'm just going to go ahead and select that. And you'll see that there's a whole bunch of instructions on how to use Git. But the one thing that you care about is this first time Git setup. So I'm going to select that. And there's a whole bunch of stuff that's going on here. If you use a command line to install Git, there's more that you need to do. But if you just use the graphical installer like I suggested, you should be able to just go down to this area where it says your identity. Configure this with a username and an email address that you want to use. Follow the instructions to do that. Now, it doesn't matter if your username and email are fake, but you do need to go ahead and configure that. The other thing that people like to do is scroll down and configure the default branch. Most organizations use a branch called main now. By default, Git started with the default of master. So a lot of people use main or trunk or something like that. You can decide what you want to use and configure it here. We are going to have to install Git onto our Docker container as well. So you'll want to make sure that those match. I think that would be easier for you to manage that way. In this part of the video, we're going to configure Git inside of our dev container, our Docker image, because remember, this is an Ubuntu operating system. We just installed it on our local computer, but it's not installed in the image itself. So let's do our Command-Shift-P or Control-Shift-P in Visual Studio Code and open folder in container and select that folder that we've been working on. Now let's open the Dockerfile and find that area where you have that argument with the Pi version. We're going to make a little space underneath that, and I'm going to paste some code in and I'll walk you through it. What we're doing is creating two new arguments. One is for the Git username, and the other is for the Git email. Remember, I walked you through that installing it locally. So we're going to have those as arguments, as variables that we can use after we install Git. So that's going to mean we come down to the bottom of our Docker file, and let's create another blank line at the bottom here. And I'm going to grab some more code and copy that in and walk you through it. Let me scroll up. And now you can see that we have the command to install Git. And that's just going to make sure that it installs the entire version of Git. That's what Git all means. And also notice that there's that -y there. Once again, if Docker tries to install something and it says, oh, is it okay if I install? Yes or no? Docker will stop. It will quit. So that's what that -y is. It's saying, yes, continue installing the product. So I'll create a few more lines and we will put in the next block of code. This is a final block of code for this. Now you can see we're configuring Git with the username and the email address. Remember, we created those arguments at the top and we're using them here. That's that Git username with the $sign in front of it and the Git email with the $sign in front of it. Also, just because most organizations use main as the default branch now, I'm doing that here. If you want to change any of these settings, feel free to change them at your leisure. Now I'll just add an extra blank line at the end of the Docker file. I'll save the Docker file, and then I'm going to do a Command-Shift-P or Control-Shift-P and type rebuild container and go ahead and do that. You might need to pause the video. It could take you a while. There, Git is installed. Now, how do I know it's installed? Well, I didn't have any errors that I encountered, so it ran, but I can also just check. So I can press Control backtick on my keyboard to open the terminal, and I'll type git space dash dash version and press return. And you can see for me, I have version 2.34.1. Could be completely different for you. I'll type exit and press return. And now I'll close the Dockerfile so we can move on to the next step. When you work with Python, it creates lots of files that you do not need to track with source control. I'm not going to get into all of those. Instead, what we're going to do is get a list from GitHub. And then we'll put that inside of our configuration for our Docker image. Go to github.com/GitHub, and you'll come to a page that looks something like this. Who knows if this logo has changed, but it is the primary repo for many of the things that GitHub releases to the public. We're going to look for a very specific repository or repo, and I'll go ahead and select that tab right here. I'm going to find a repository, and I'm going to call it gitignore. A gitignore file allows us to identify the files that we don't want Git to track. So we'll select this gitignore repository here, and then we'll just scroll down. You'll see that there's gitignores for all sorts of programming languages and other things. But what we want is Python. So you can just scroll down. It's in alphabetical order. And we'll scroll, and find Python. There we go. Python.gitignore. So I'm going to select that. And then I'm going to come over here to where it says raw. You should find a button there somewhere. Select that. And you can see this is all of the stuff that we do not necessarily need to track with Git. Select all of them by doing Command A or Control A on your keyboard, and then copy it with Command C or Control C on your keyboard. Back in Visual Studio Code, we're going to create a new file. Select the new file icon and type .gitignore, all lowercase, all one word, .gitignore, and press return. Now paste in the code that you just copied. And at the end of the line, add an extra line. That's something I really like to do. And then save the file. We're about to publish this as a repository to GitHub that we can then use as a template. But before we do that, I like to create a little README file. This is something that I and others can read to understand how to use it. Now, you normally get a little bit more verbose than what I'm about to do. So we're just going to create a new file at the root of our folder here and type readme in capital letters .md in small letters, readme.md, and press return. This readme file is going to be in what's called Markdown language. If you don't know what Markdown is, that's okay. We're just going to be typing some things to make it easier than typing in HTML and code and things like that. I'm going to type # space my Docker AI and machine learning template. Press return once or twice, and then you can provide more information on how to use a template. Whatever you learn that is most useful to you, you could put in this README file. I'm going to leave it just like this for now and save the file. Throughout this entire video series, we've been opening up this My AI Docker image folder and working with the files. Now we're going to be moving these files up onto GitHub to turn it into a template. Once we start using Git, GitHub, or GitLab, any other kind of Git-based service, we tend to call that folder a repo, and that stands for repository. Now I'm going to be talking about My AI Docker image repository or repo, and the files within there, we'll still call them files, but those are files that are under source control. So we're going to refer to them as code. So we're going to have a repo, which is the folder that we're working in, and code, and those are the files that we're working with. That slight variation in language is something that you'll have to get familiar with if it's not something you're already familiar with. Those are two important things to remember. Repo is the folder or repository, and files are the code. Let's get started. Okay, let's take our folder and convert it to a GitHub repo. So I'm going to close down this README file so we are nice and clean here in our Visual Studio Code user interface. I'm going to type my Command-Shift-P or Control-Shift-P and type publish to GitHub. Now, remember, before I do this, you should have in the prerequisite section set up a GitHub account already. And you also should have signed in to make sure that there weren't any signing in issues. If you have not done that, now is the time to do it and come back to this video. But I'm going to move forward and press return. What I see and what you see when I press the return key might be different. If this is your first time using GitHub, you might have to go through a number of steps to authorize Visual Studio Code to use GitHub and vice versa. Then you might even have to come back and do this publish to GitHub option again. So know that you might have a few extra steps to take that I don't. I'm going to press return, and then it's going to say, do you want your Docker AI image to be private or public? I like to keep my things public unless there's something secret I'm trying to hide. Maybe someone else would like to use my repo, and I'm absolutely fine with someone downloading it, what they call forking it, cloning it, whatever. I'm okay with that. If you're not, then make it a private repo. Now I'm going to choose that public repo and also just keep the name the same. I'll press return. And after a few moments, you'll get a dialog that looks like this, where it says open in GitHub. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Here we're on GitHub, and I went ahead and expanded it. I zoomed in a little bit so it's easier to see on YouTube. But you can see here's all the files that we worked with. And there's that README file too that we created. Now there's a few ways that we can use this repo as a template. You or someone else could just simply go to the code option here and download it as a zip file or open it in Visual Studio Code. Then just rename the folder on their computer so it's a new repo name. The other way they could do it is to fork the repo. So create a copy, even though there's some sort of a linkage back to your original repo. No one can make changes to your code without their first pushing the request and you deciding whether you're going to do anything about it or not. So you don't need to worry about people making changes and impacting your code. But that is another option. But the one you really want is to just create a new repo and start from this image. So let's do that. Let's go to the settings tab up above the fork there, if you can see it. And I'm going to go ahead and select that. Now, your user interface might be different than mine because GitHub has a tendency to change the user interface. But what you're looking for is to turn it into a template repository. I'm going to go ahead and select that. And that's all I need to do in order to make that a template. Now let's go ahead and create a new repo based on the template. So you can see over here at the top right side of GitHub, for me, there is a plus sign that says create new. And if I open it, it says new repository. Your user interface again might be slightly different, so just go ahead and find a way to create a new repo and select that. Now you'll be at this new repository page. We're going to first select our template, and that should show up right here. You can see there I have my AI Docker image. Use that as a template. I'm not going to include all branches. You can read up on that if you want to. And then I'm going to give it a repository name, and I'll call this my new AI project. And I'm going to put dashes in between every word instead of using spaces. And then I'll just give it a description, testing my AI and ML template. There we go. And then finally, it's going to ask, do you want to make this public or private? I'm going to make this public and go ahead and click Create Repository. There, now we have a brand new repo called My New AI Project, and there is all of the code. It's just a copy of what we created earlier. We have worked so hard to create our template, and it's up there on GitHub. Let's go ahead and pull this down. I'm going to type Command-Shift-P or Control-Shift-P on my keyboard. I'm going to type git clone. And when I press return, it's going to start asking what repository I want to clone. If this is your first time, you might be prompted with some security requests and things like that. So just know you might need to come back to the git clone as well. So I'm going to press return, and then I'm going to choose from GitHub. And there's a list of all the repos. Yours should show up towards the top. I see that my new AI project shows up as the second one. So I'll go ahead and press return. Now this time I'm going to place it on my desktop, but make sure you do not select another folder. We want this to be at the root of our desktop. So I'll just go ahead and press return to accept that. You might be prompted with a number of things asking you to authorize downloaded files and things like that. But it's also going to ask you if you want to open the cloned directory or repository rather. So yes, go ahead and open that. Now that it's open, we are still just on our local computer. We have not built it to specifically run as a dev container yet. That's why I'm getting this pop-up dialog asking if I want to rebuild the container. But let's not do that quite yet. I'm going to come over here to the Dockerfile and make one minor change, which is to come over here to the Git username and the Git email address. So I'm going to change my username to Bill Raymond, and I'm going to change my email address to the one that I'm also using on GitHub, which is bill.raymond@cambermas.com, and I'll save that. Now that I've saved the file, I can rebuild it. So I'll just go ahead and close the Docker file, do my Command-Shift-P or Control-Shift-P, and then rebuild and reopen container. I'll press return. This could take a while for you, or it could happen fairly quickly. There, that took about 5 minutes for me, and now I'm up and running inside my dev container. Now there's one thing that's going on here, which is that you can see the Docker file has this letter M next to it that says modified. And if I take a look over here at the source control icon, it says that there's one pending change. So let's go ahead over there and notice that there's this Docker file that's been modified. As we're making changes to our files, Git's going to track those. And I might want to commit those changes after a period of time. In this case, I definitely do. I want to keep that change that I just made to the Docker file. So I'm going to go ahead and come to the message up here, and I'm going to type modified username and email, and I'll just go ahead and select the commit button. And then I'm going to sync the changes. I'm going to push them up to GitHub. So I'll go ahead and do that. It's going to ask me if I want to. I'll say okay. There, you've done it. You've created a template, and now you've just created your very first repo from that template. And you're good to go. You can start adding Python code. You can create notebooks, anything that you want in here. Thank you for watching this video. If you want more like this, please like, comment, and click the bell to support my channel.